For 18 years, the Son of God disappears from recorded history. One moment, he is a 12-year-old boy standing in the Temple of Jerusalem, astonishing the wisest scholars in Israel with questions no child should be able to ask. And then, silence. Not a single word, not one verse. 18 years vanish from the most scrutinized life in human history. Where did he go? What did he become? And why did the gospel writers, who recorded his every miracle, his every parable, choose to bury the most formative years of his life in complete darkness? Tonight, we step into that silence. The town of Nazareth in the 1st century was not a place anyone expected greatness to come from. It was small, dusty, and forgotten, tucked into the hills of Galilee, far from the political and religious heart of Jerusalem. Fewer than 400 people lived there. There was no synagogue built of stone, no grand marketplace, no Roman garrison stationed at its gates. It was, by every measure of the ancient world, insignificant. And that insignificance is precisely why the question of what happened there, in that forgotten town, over nearly 2 decades, matters so much. Because if the answers exist anywhere, they exist buried beneath the dust of a place history nearly forgot to mention. Joseph the carpenter and his wife Mary raised their son in a home built from limestone and timber, the kind of modest dwelling that dotted the Galilean hillside. Life in Nazareth moved to the rhythm of the sun and the seasons.
Mornings began before dawn, with the smell of baking bread and the sound of chickens stirring in the courtyard. Water was drawn from the village well, a task most likely performed by Mary and the other women of the household, carried in clay jars balanced against the hip. The family's survival depended on labor. Joseph was a tekton, a word often translated simply as carpenter, but which more accurately describes a builder, a craftsman skilled in wood and stone alike. In a region where Roman construction projects were reshaping entire cities, a man with Joseph's skills would have found steady, if unglamorous, work. It is here, in this humble setting, that the boy Jesus grew. The Gospel of Luke offers only a single sentence to describe this period, that he grew in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man. One sentence to summarize what may have been the most quietly extraordinary childhood in human history. Ancient Jewish boys of Nazareth would have begun their education early, learning to read and recite Torah, likely under the instruction of a local teacher or perhaps their own father. By the age of 5, a child in a devout household was expected to begin memorizing scripture. By 10, the study of Mishnah, the oral tradition of Jewish law, would commence. By 13, a boy became a son of the commandment, bar mitzvah, obligated to observe the full weight of Jewish law as an adult. But Jesus was 12, not 13, when the incident occurred that gives us our only glimpse into his adolescence.
Every year, Joseph and Mary traveled from Nazareth to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, joining a caravan of pilgrims that would have stretched for miles along the dusty roads, family groups walking together in the protective anonymity of the crowd. It was custom for extended family and neighbors from the same village to travel together, singing psalms as they walked, celebrating a shared identity as the people of Israel making their pilgrimage to the holy city. In such a crowd, it would not have been unusual for a 12-year-old boy to walk somewhere in the procession without his parents watching every step. Children moved freely between family groups, eating and resting with whichever relatives or friends happened to be nearby. It was only after a full day's journey away from Jerusalem that Mary and Joseph realized their son was missing. Panic must have gripped them instantly. They searched among relatives. They searched among friends. He was nowhere. And so they turned back, retracing the long road to Jerusalem, a journey that would have taken the better part of another day, their fear mounting with every mile. For 3 days the boy was lost to them. 3 days in a city swollen with pilgrims, soldiers, merchants, and thieves. 3 days that any parent in any century would recognize as an eternity of dread. They found him in the temple, not lost, not frightened, not wandering the streets in search of his family. He was sitting among the teachers of Israel, the most learned men in the nation, listening to them and asking them questions. And the text tells us something remarkable. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. This was not a child being taught. This was a child engaging with the greatest religious minds of his generation as something closer to an equal. When his mother, with the particular exhaustion of a parent who has feared the worst, asked why he had done this to them, his response has echoed through 2,000 years of theological reflection. Did they not know he must be about his Father's business? And then, after this single extraordinary moment, the narrative closes like a door. He went down with them to Nazareth and was subject to them. Luke tells us again only that he grew in wisdom and stature. That is all. That is the entirety of the biblical record for the years between 12 and 30. 18 years reduced to 2 verses of summary. For a figure whose every recorded action would later be scrutinized, debated, and preserved with meticulous care, this silence is staggering. And it has provoked centuries of speculation, legend, apocryphal writing, and, in more recent centuries, genuine historical inquiry. Why would the Gospel writers, particularly Luke, who identifies himself as a careful historian gathering accounts from eyewitnesses, choose to leave such an enormous gap? One answer lies in the purpose of the Gospels themselves. They were not written as biographies in the modern sense, cradle-to-grave chronicles cataloging every year of a life.
They were theological documents composed to testify to the identity and mission of Jesus as the Messiah, crafted for communities who needed to understand who he was and what his death and resurrection meant for their salvation. The years of quiet labor in a Galilean workshop, however formative, did not serve that immediate theological purpose. The authors selected what mattered for their message, and the ordinary years of craftsmanship, however remarkable the man living them may have been, simply were not central to that message. But absence of record is not absence of life. Those 18 years happened. A human body grew, aged, labored, and endured the ordinary trials of an ancient existence. And so historians and theologians alike have spent centuries attempting to reconstruct, from context, from culture, from the barest threads of evidence, what those years might have contained. The most sober and widely accepted reconstruction begins with the simple assumption that Jesus continued the family trade. As the eldest son, following the death of Joseph, which many scholars believe occurred sometime during this period, given his complete absence from the narrative of Jesus' adult ministry, the responsibility of supporting the family would have fallen to him. This was not merely tradition, it was survival. In the tightly structured economy of first-century Galilee, family businesses passed from father to eldest son, and the obligation to provide for a widowed mother and younger siblings was not optional.
The Gospels tell us Jesus had brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and sisters whose names are not recorded. A household of this size required steady income, and a trade like carpentry in a region undergoing significant Roman construction would have provided it. Consider what this labor would have actually looked like. The nearby city of Sepphoris, only an hour's walk from Nazareth, was undergoing a massive rebuilding project during this exact period, following its destruction by Roman forces in a rebellion that occurred around the time of Jesus' birth. Herod Antipas, the regional ruler, poured resources into transforming Sepphoris into a magnificent administrative capital, complete with a theater, palaces, and elaborate public buildings. Archaeological excavations have revealed a city of remarkable sophistication for the region, with mosaic floors, colonnaded streets, and Roman-style architecture. A skilled tecton from a neighboring village would have had ready employment there. It is entirely plausible, many historians argue, that Jesus spent significant portions of these hidden years not isolated in rural Nazareth, but working construction in a bustling Greco-Roman city, surrounded by the full diversity of first-century Galilean life. Jews and Gentiles, laborers and administrators, all mingling in a single urban space. This detail matters more than it might first appear.
It suggests that the man who would later speak so fluently in parables involving vineyards, construction, foundations built on rock versus sand, and laborers hired at different hours of the day, was not drawing on abstract theological imagery. He was drawing on lived experience. He had likely stood on scaffolding. He had likely felt the particular ache of a day spent shaping stone and timber under a Mediterranean sun. When he later warned that a house built on sand would collapse in the storm, he may have been remembering a specific failure he witnessed, or perhaps one he had been called to help rebuild. But the theory of a quiet carpenter's life in Galilee, plausible as it is, has never satisfied everyone. For centuries, other traditions have circulated, some rooted in early apocryphal writings, others born of much later speculation, all attempting to fill the same aching silence with something more dramatic. One of the oldest alternative traditions concerns Egypt. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that following the visit of the Magi, Joseph was warned in a dream to flee with Mary and the infant Jesus into Egypt, escaping the murderous decree of King Herod. This flight is biblically attested, though the Gospel places it in Jesus' infancy, not adolescence, with the family returning to Nazareth after Herod's death. Yet some ancient traditions, along with certain modern speculative theories, have proposed that Jesus may have returned to Egypt as a young man, drawn to the intellectual and mystical centers of Alexandria, one of the greatest cities of learning in the ancient world.
Alexandria was home to an extraordinary library, a massive Jewish population that had developed its own sophisticated theological traditions, and mystery schools that blended Greek philosophy, Egyptian religious thought, and Jewish scripture into something new and syncretic. Proponents of this theory point to certain philosophical resonances between the teachings later attributed to Jesus and the Hellenistic Jewish philosophy associated with figures like Philo of Alexandria, a contemporary Jewish thinker who attempted to harmonize Platonic philosophy with the Hebrew scriptures. They ask whether a mind as sharp as the one displayed by the 12-year-old boy in the temple, a mind capable of astonishing the elders of Israel, might have sought out the greatest center of learning available to a Jew of that era. It is a compelling narrative. It is also almost entirely speculative, resting more on plausibility and the appeal of mystery than on any direct textual or archaeological evidence. No ancient source claims Jesus traveled to Alexandria as a young man. The theory survives because the silence of the Gospels leaves room for it, not because any concrete evidence supports it. A far more elaborate and far more contested tradition claims that Jesus journeyed east to India and even Tibet during these hidden years, studying under Hindu and Buddhist teachers before returning to Judea to begin his ministry.
This theory gained significant public attention in the late 19th century through the writings of a Russian traveler named Nicholas Notovich, who claimed to have discovered an ancient manuscript in a Himalayan monastery describing the travels of a young prophet named Isa, identified with Jesus, who studied Buddhist and Hindu texts in India before returning to preach in his homeland. Notovich's account captured public imagination and has been repeated and expanded upon by various spiritual movements ever since. However, the historical credibility of this theory has been thoroughly challenged. When scholars traveled to the monastery Notovich described and interviewed the monks he claimed to have spoken with, they found no record of any such manuscript, and the monks denied any knowledge of the story he told. Subsequent investigation strongly suggests that Notovich either fabricated the account entirely or significantly embellished a much vaguer local legend. No credible archaeological, textual, or historical evidence from the 1st century supports the claim that Jesus traveled to India. The theory persists in certain circles today, not because of evidence, but because it offers an appealing narrative bridging Eastern and Western spiritual traditions, and because, once again, the silence of the Gospels leaves a vacuum that human imagination is eager to fill. A third and more historically grounded theory concerns the Essenes, a Jewish sect known primarily through the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the caves of Qumran near the Dead Sea beginning in 1947.
The Essenes were an ascetic, highly disciplined religious community who withdrew from mainstream Jewish society, believing that the temple priesthood in Jerusalem had become corrupt. They lived in tightly organized communities, practiced ritual purification, shared property communally, and awaited what they believed would be an imminent apocalyptic intervention by God into human history. Their writings reveal a community obsessed with purity, prophecy, and the coming of a messianic figure, or in some interpretations, two messianic figures, one priestly and one royal.
Some scholars have noted intriguing parallels between Essene practices and later Christian theology and practice, including shared meals with religious significance, an emphasis on spiritual purity, apocalyptic expectation, and a communal structure that echoes descriptions of the earliest Christian communities in the Book of Acts. Could the young Jesus have spent time among the Essenes, perhaps at their settlement at Qumran, absorbing their intense apocalyptic worldview and their rigorous spiritual discipline before breaking away to forge his own distinct message? It is an intriguing possibility, and unlike the India theory, it rests on genuine archaeological and textual evidence about a real, historically documented community operating in Judea during exactly the period in question. Yet the theory faces serious difficulties. The Gospel accounts of Jesus' adult ministry show him behaving in ways starkly different from Essene practice.
Where the Essenes practiced strict separation from sinners and ritually impure individuals, Jesus was criticized by his contemporaries precisely for doing the opposite, eating with tax collectors and those considered sinners, touching the ritually unclean, healing on the Sabbath in ways that violated strict interpretations of the law. Where the Essenes emphasized secrecy and initiation into hidden knowledge available only to the inner circle, Jesus taught openly in public squares, in synagogues, on hillsides, to crowds of thousands. If he had indeed spent formative years among the Essenes, his adult ministry represents not a continuation, but a dramatic and deliberate rejection of many of their core practices. This does not make the connection impossible. It is entirely plausible that a young man might absorb a tradition deeply and then consciously chart a different course, shaped by that experience even in his rejection of it. But it means the theory, however tantalizing, remains an inference built on parallel and contrast rather than direct evidence of presence. Beyond these specific theories of travel and affiliation, historians have also worked to reconstruct the simple texture of daily life in Nazareth, and this reconstruction may tell us more than any theory of distant travel. Archaeological excavations of first-century Galilean villages reveal homes built around central courtyards, shared by extended families, with rooftop spaces used for sleeping in the warmer months, and storage of grain and dried goods.
Meals centered on bread, baked fresh from wheat or barley flour, supplemented by olives, olive oil, legumes, and occasionally fish, salted and dried for preservation, brought from the Sea of Galilee. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for festivals and special occasions. Wine, typically diluted with water, was the standard drink. This is the world in which Jesus' parables were formed, a world where a woman searching for a single lost coin represented real desperation, where a shepherd leaving 99 sheep to search for one lost animal reflected an economy where every single animal mattered to a family's survival, where a father dividing his inheritance early to a wayward son represented not an abstract morality tale, but a genuinely scandalous and reckless act within the honor-bound economic structures of Jewish family life. Religious education in Nazareth, though the village lacked a formal synagogue building in the grand sense, would have centered on communal gatherings, likely in a private home or a simple meeting space, where the Torah was read and discussed. Jewish boys were expected to develop not just familiarity with Scripture, but genuine fluency, capable of quoting extensively from memory. This educational intensity explains, at least in part, the astonishment of the temple teachers when confronted with the 12-year-old Jesus.
A boy raised in this tradition of rigorous memorization and communal discussion, gifted with unusual intellectual and spiritual insight, might well have developed the kind of interpretive skill that could hold its own against trained scholars, particularly if his questions probed at the deeper theological tensions those scholars themselves wrestle with. There is also the matter of Jesus' relationship with his extended family during these years, a topic the Gospels touch on with occasional, tantalizing brevity. We know he had brothers and sisters. We know that later, during his public ministry, his family's relationship to him was complicated. At one point, the Gospel of Mark describes his family attempting to restrain him, believing he was out of his mind, suggesting that whatever unfolded during those quiet years in Nazareth, his siblings did not necessarily anticipate or fully understand what he would become. His brother James, remarkably, would later emerge as a central leader of the Jerusalem church following the resurrection, suggesting a dramatic transformation in belief,
That itself hints at the complicated, gradual process by which even those closest to Jesus came to understand who he was. This detail alone is worth sitting with. If even his own brother needed the events of the crucifixion and resurrection to fully believe, it suggests that whatever unfolded in Nazareth during those hidden years, it was not so overtly miraculous or dramatic that it eliminated all doubt among those who lived beside him.
This point deserves emphasis because it corrects a common misconception. Popular imagination sometimes pictures the hidden years as secretly filled with miracles, healings, and supernatural displays simply unrecorded. But the biblical and historical evidence points in the opposite direction. The Gospel of John explicitly states that the miracle at the wedding in Cana, turning water into wine, was the first sign Jesus performed, marking the beginning of his public ministry. This suggests strongly that whatever the nature of those hidden years, they were not characterized by public displays of supernatural power. They were, by all indication, remarkably ordinary. A boy who grew, a young man who worked, a son who supported his family, an observant Jew who prayed, studied, and lived within the rhythms of his community. The extraordinary nature of those years, if it existed at all beyond the ordinary, existed internally, in the deepening of wisdom, understanding, and purpose that Luke's single sentence gestures toward but does not detail. This raises one of the more profound theological questions embedded in the hidden years. What did it mean, if Christian theology holds that Jesus was both fully divine and fully human, for that humanity to develop across childhood and adolescence into adulthood in the same way any other human being develops? The Gospel of Luke's statement that he grew in wisdom implies a genuine process of growth, not a fully formed omniscience simply concealed within a child's body.
This has been a subject of extensive theological reflection for 2,000 years, and it remains genuinely mysterious. If Jesus experienced authentic human development, then the hidden years were not merely a gap in the record, but a period of real, lived formation, in which a fully human mind and spirit grew toward the fullness of purpose that would define his public ministry. Whatever divine self-understanding he carried, and the temple episode suggests he possessed some clear sense of unique relationship to God even at 12, it existed alongside and was expressed through an authentically human process of maturation. We should also consider the political and social atmosphere of Galilee during these specific decades, because Jesus did not grow up in a vacuum. This was a turbulent, occupied land. Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, ruled Galilee as a client king under Roman authority, a position that required constant political maneuvering to satisfy Roman overlords while managing a Jewish population that deeply resented foreign occupation. Tax burdens were heavy, layered between Roman imperial taxation, Herodian taxation, and the temple tax owed to the priesthood in Jerusalem. Some historians estimate that peasant families in Galilee may have owed as much as a third or more of their annual produce and income across these various obligations, creating widespread economic strain that fueled both resentment and periodic uprisings.
Jesus would have grown up hearing stories, perhaps even witnessing firsthand, the tension between Jewish nationalist aspiration and Roman imperial power. The rebellion following Herod the Great's death, which led to the Roman destruction of Sepphoris itself, occurred in the immediate years surrounding Jesus' birth, meaning the rebuilding of that city, the very construction project that likely employed him and Joseph, was itself a monument to Roman military dominance over Jewish resistance. Every day spent laboring on that construction site would have been a day spent, quite literally, building the infrastructure of the occupying power. This context adds a layer of complexity to the eventual content of Jesus' teaching, which so often addressed themes of power, justice, the treatment of the poor, and the nature of true kingship, in ways that both engaged with and subverted the political anxieties of his time. When he later spoke about rendering unto Caesar what belonged to Caesar, and unto God what belonged to God, he was speaking into a lifetime of lived experience with exactly this tension between imperial demand and religious devotion. Religious movements were also stirring throughout Judea and Galilee during these decades, forming the backdrop against which Jesus' own emergence would eventually make sense. The Pharisees were developing their influential tradition of oral law and rigorous personal piety, emphasizing that ordinary people, not just priests,
could live in a state of ritual holiness through careful observance.
The Sadducees, aligned closely with the temple priesthood and the wealthy aristocracy, held different theological positions, rejecting concepts like resurrection of the dead that the Pharisees embraced. Zealot movements advocating for violent resistance against Roman occupation were gaining strength, particularly in the more rural and northern regions, including Galilee itself, a region the Romans regarded with particular suspicion as a hotbed of nationalist sentiment. And John, the son of a priest named Zechariah and a relative of Jesus through Mary's family connection to Elizabeth, was, during these same hidden years, presumably undergoing his own formation in the wilderness, developing the ascetic, prophetic identity that would eventually announce itself at the Jordan River. It is worth pausing on John the Baptist specifically, because the Gospel of Luke tells us that he too spent time in the wilderness, growing and becoming strong in spirit until the day of his public appearance to Israel. This phrase mirrors, almost deliberately, the language used to describe Jesus' own hidden growth. Some scholars have wondered whether Jesus and John, as relatives, maintained any contact during these years, whether the eventual meeting at the Jordan River, when John recognized Jesus and declared him the one who was to come, represented a first encounter between two men who had each undergone their own private formation, or a reunion between cousins who had known of each other's journey all along. The text does not tell us definitively.
John himself states in the Gospel of John that he did not know Jesus, in the sense of recognizing his messianic identity, until the moment the Spirit descended upon him at his baptism, suggesting that whatever family connection existed, John's prophetic recognition of who Jesus truly was arrived as a distinct spiritual revelation, not simply prior familiarity. This brings us, finally, to the threshold of the moment when the silence breaks. The Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. 30 was a significant age in Jewish culture, associated in various biblical texts with the beginning of priestly service and mature public responsibility, the age at which the prophet Ezekiel began his ministry, the age at which King David began to reign. Whether this age carried deliberate symbolic weight for the Gospel writers or simply reflected the historical reality of when Jesus' public work began, it marks the moment the 18 years of silence conclude and the recorded ministry begins. What we are left with, after all the theories, all the speculation, all the apocryphal legends of Egyptian mystery schools and Himalayan monasteries, is a more modest but perhaps more profound picture. A boy who grew up in obscurity, in a forgotten village, in an occupied land, under the weight of ordinary human obligation, laboring with his hands, studying his people's ancient scriptures, absorbing the rhythms and tensions and hardships of first-century Jewish life. A young man who, by all indication, gave no outward sign of the extraordinary mission that awaited him, who was known to his neighbors simply as the carpenter's son, whose own townspeople would later react with disbelief and offense when he returned to Nazareth as a teacher, asking incredulously where this wisdom and these mighty works could possibly have come from. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, whose brothers and sisters we know? That reaction, recorded in the Gospel of Mark, may be the single most revealing detail we have about the hidden years. The people of Nazareth, who had watched him grow, who had known him as a child playing in their streets, who had perhaps purchased furniture or hired construction work from his hands, expressed genuine astonishment and even offense at the wisdom he displayed as a teacher. This tells us, more clearly than any apocryphal gospel or speculative theory, that whatever unfolded in Nazareth during those 18 years, it did not announce itself.
Perhaps that is the deeper mystery the Gospels was always pointing toward, not a hidden narrative of travel to distant lands or secret initiation into mystical societies, but something far more quietly astonishing, a divine purpose unfolding entirely within the unremarkable texture of an ordinary human life, within sawdust and sweat, within family obligation and religious study, within the long, undocumented, unglamorous accumulation of years that every human life requires before it steps into whatever it was always going to become. The silence, in the end, may not be an absence of story at all. It may be the story, told in the only language capable of containing it, the language of ordinary time, patiently, invisibly, becoming extraordinary. And when at last that silence broke,
when a man walked down to the Jordan River and stood before a wild prophet in camel's hair, when the sky itself was said to open and a voice declared, "This is my beloved Son." The 18 hidden years did not disappear into irrelevance. They stood behind that moment, unseen but undeniably present, the long, invisible foundation beneath the visible beginning of everything that followed.